Today I'm going to share about what I think is one of the most important topics when people come to therapy for working through trauma or working on attachment or relationship problems, and that is transference, countertransference, and the therapeutic relationship. So, what is transference? Transference is the unconscious dynamic between the therapist and the client, and it's how the client is kind of relating to the therapist. Sometimes this can, if we're looking at how it shows up, and what a client is often aware of is the client's thinking, what is the therapist feeling about me? What are they thinking about me? What about the therapist reminds them of other people in their life? Now, the unconscious piece is often things like how the therapist reminds them of like an attachment figure. For example, if like they had some challenges with one of their parents or, whoever raised them as a child, those same kind of dynamics, like feeling abandoned, feeling neglected, feeling invalidated, those can very easily get constellated in the therapeutic relationship. And it kind of makes sense, right? Because if you have a lot of experiences of feeling let down or misunderstood, or not getting your needs met, it would make sense that if you enter into a relationship where, this therapist is supposed to be a safe space, supposed to be kind of like providing this holding environment, that there could be this fear of those past experiences getting recreated and an increased sensitivity in those areas, right? So if the therapist, for example, maybe they have some back problems or something and they lean back in session, the client could pick up on that and think, ooh, they're leaning back because, they didn't like what I said, right? They're taking space. The client could be like perceiving the therapist's behavior and reading into it based off of their previous experiences. Now, one thing that can also be true is that therapists can play into these dynamics. And they can also at times be unconscious of, what their countertransference is, which is like how they're relating to this client. And there's always the potential for what we call like enactments, which is where we're repeating previous dynamics and we're living them out in the therapy relationship. And this is where I think feedback is so important, because from a depth psychology perspective, the therapist is often doomed to repeat the previous like wounding and like trigger that wound in some way, shape, or form. So for example, like if someone has a history of feeling abandoned by a parent, maybe the therapist like is, suddenly sick and has to take a day off and cancels last minute, or maybe the therapist forgets that client appointment. There's lots of ways this can happen, or the therapist drops the ball emotionally speaking, right? And the client feels like, oh, this was a big wound. Now, ideally, there's enough safety and rapport that's been developed in the therapy relationship where the client can then say to the therapist, hey, I feel like you really let me down. Or, when you canceled last minute, it made me feel like, do I not matter? Are you not there for me? Can I even rely on you? And then by being able to actually talk about it, then the therapist and the client can work together to really see, okay, what's this feeling? In this experience, like, can we really sink into it? Can we deepen into it? Can we talk it through? Ideally, the therapist will not be defensive in this moment and will be able to like kind of hold the discomfort of being in like that dialogue. It can be very uncomfortable, right? Especially if a therapist feels like they've let down a client or they've acted in a way that's not congruent with who they are or with their values. Excuse me. So they can kind of, if the therapist has done a lot of work or if they're getting their own support and ideally they're feeling very resourced, they can have this kind of a conversation, which we can call like we have the rupture, which is whatever that event was that led to the client feeling, like the relationship between them was harmed, and then the repair. And the repair comes from being able to have a non-defensive conversation and really seeking to understand what happened. And I think seeking to understand is important, because the second we try to like rationalize or justify what we did as a therapist, it really just like collapses everything. But if we can stay in the symbolic representation of what that was like for them, what it brought up for them in childhood, what happened that felt similar, we open up opportunities for new perspective, for deeper healing too, to kind of see, oh, yeah, like I am really sensitive to if someone's running late. It makes me feel the way it felt, when this attachment figure would run late. It makes me wonder, are they ever going to come? It causes anxiety in this way. Excuse me. So, it can be very, very fruitful to be able to have these conversations. And if we're not able to have those conversations, I think this is where people will drop out of therapy prematurely, or it will kind of like simmer and then turn into something bigger. And the beautiful thing is when we're able to have these conversations, and it's reparative, like it's often the fact that it is corrective is what helps with the repair, right? So if the therapist is able to be validating and really hold what happened and explore it with the client, often then, and even take like corrective action if needed, right? That can be a really healing experience for someone who's never had someone respond to them in that way. So I think even though it can be very painful, both for the therapist and the client, and very uncomfortable to address ruptures or to address like the transference and the countertransference, like what's playing out between the therapist and the client, it can often have such great gifts. Like you can really, like the therapy relationship can feel a lot stronger, safer. There can be more trust because you can know like, oh, hey, I can share things that are hard to talk about and my therapist will receive them. Like they're not going to shame me. They're not going to invalidate me. They're going to hear me out. They care about my well-being more than they care about their ego or about being right. And I think these things are really valuable and honestly quite priceless. And what this also does is it empowers, the client to then have these kinds of repair conversations in their day-to-day life with people. Of course, not everyone is going to be able to like do a repair, like to meet someone's needs in that way. But I think it's pretty empowering for someone to get to have that practice of like bringing up something that impacted them, being able to see, okay, what part of this is me, like what part of this dynamic is some of my unresolved material, what of this like belongs to the past, belongs to other relationships and is getting placed onto the therapy relationship, and then what part of it is like the therapist stuff too, because they say with projection, that projection is like hanging a jacket on a hook. This is like from Marie-Louise von Franz, her book on projection and recollection. And so like for the therapist to hold a projection, often the therapist has a role in it, right? And so, for example, like when I felt let down by my own therapist, at one point I realized like I had picked someone who was not a perfectionist. And then when they made a mistake that someone who's not a perfectionist would make, I had to kind of like grapple with that with her and talk to her through it. And she was able to say, yeah, you're right. Like I'm type B, like I am not a perfectionist. And that was actually really helpful for me, because it was like, okay, my perception actually did line up with her like perceived reality, and our relationship was much stronger because of that. And that's a relatively like simple description of what happened. Often working through these things, it can feel very intense. It can feel very intimidating or overwhelming, but I think there's a lot we can gain from processing through them. And there's, it's kind of inevitable if we're working very closely with someone, as a therapist or as a client, at some point there's going to be something that comes up. And these options to engage in rupture or repair, they're pretty valuable, and I think it's important to not foreclose them. And I just think it's so healing from an attachment perspective when we're able to navigate through this with kind of like our values intact. But yes, I hope that this was a helpful conversation for you today. I really recommend Marie von Franz's book on projection. I might do a separate video on projection sometime soon. So if this was useful for you, please feel free to like, subscribe, or comment below. I'd be interested in hearing your questions. Thank you for listening.